A Hoc Est Bellum History Marsh collaboration. The year is 48 BCE. Julius Caesar is stationed at the city of Brundisium, waiting to cross the Adriatic Sea. He is after the Republican forces that retreated across the sea to Greece, led by his arch-rival Pompey Magnus. A pivotal conflict of ancient history was about to take place. And for those of you that are into history, welcome to the year 1861. For this video, we partnered up with War and Peace, American Civil War, one of the top MMO mobile real-time strategy games. Experience an authentic old-school strategy by building realistic, iconic armies, develop your town, and research new technologies. You can side with the Union and Abraham Lincoln, or join the Confederacy with Jefferson Davis, and pick multiple commanders based on the famous Civil War personalities, each of whom have individual skills and bonuses. Our favorite feature in War and Peace is the amazing team play and alliance cooperation system, where you can utilize multiplayer strategies and tactics with your friends against thousands of players on maps based on historical battlefields. And you can even become president and give orders to your teammates. Best yet, the game is completely free to play. Try it out using our link in the description and join the fight in War and Peace, American Civil War. The previous year was a busy one for Julius Caesar. He had declared war on the Senate, marched on Rome, and proceeded to capture most of the Italian peninsula, constantly chasing after the Senate's forces. His civil war was a characteristic outcome of his personality. He was a man of an overgrown sense of worth and self-importance, and he would not allow a bunch of old bureaucrats to tell him what to do and when to do it, let alone willingly deprive himself of his political power by handing over his legions and rendering himself defenseless in the face of certain persecution and marginalization, or even imprisonment and murder. Because this was the situation he faced just before he embarked on his civil war, when the Senate specifically ordered him to disband his legions and forbade him to run for consul for the second time, something that would have stripped him of his legal immunity. Back at Brundisium, Caesar was contemplating a crossing with two glaring problems in his mind. The first being his significantly inferior fleet in comparison with that of his enemies who were patrolling the area, and the second being the fact that sailing in winter was pretty risky in antiquity, since ancient ships could not cope well with severe weather conditions. On the other hand, a passage through Illyricum would have been next to impossible. The delay would have been great, and the route was treacherous, full of perils and hostile local tribes. So on the night of 4th of January, or 6th of November according to the modern calendar, Caesar, with 7 legions and 500 cavalry, crossed the Adriatic Sea and successfully avoided the patrols of the Republican navy, landing somewhere to the south of Palesta. Meanwhile, Pompey, who was stationed at the city of Veroia, was declared the supreme commander of the Republican forces, an appointment that gave him supreme authority over the forces of the Roman state. And it was at this stage that he left Veroia and began his march towards Epirus in order to station his legions within the winter quarters of the area. Caesar had pushed on through the ragged ground of the area in which he landed, and came down upon two completely unsuspecting cities, Apollonia and Oricum. The surprise was such that he captured them without any bloodshed. Moving northwards, Caesar's strategic goal was becoming clear. He was trying to deprive Pompey from his western coastal provinces and cut off the supply depots which were vital for his Adriatic fleet, an Adriatic fleet that was seriously hindering his army's own communications and supply routes, forcing him to live by foraging the rocky and scarce land of Epirus that barely sustained its local population. Pompey must have heard about Caesar's landing and immediately understood his intentions. He forced-marched his army in order to cut Caesar's northward advance, eventually managing to insert himself between Caesar and Dyrrachium at Asparagum, a critical crossroad that controlled the Roman Via Egnatia. The two armies faced each other on the opposite banks of the river Apsus, modern-day Simon. Caesar had significantly inferior forces in comparison to Pompey's, so naturally Pompey tried to force the Caesarians into an unwanted and unfavorable engagement against his legions. But while he was attempting a crossing, the bridge collapsed. The stalemate was inevitable. Of course, Caesar was not being idle. He repeatedly appealed to his generals to send him reinforcements, but his generals had to face the same unfavorable and tricky conditions, plus the assiduous patrolling of the Republican fleet. Finally, Mark Antony, with 4 legions and a detachment of light troops and cavalry, managed to cross the Adriatic. But due to unexpected conditions, his transports were blown further north than he intended, into the Bay of Nymphaeum. This delicate and complicated maneuvering, the chess of war, continued by the two masters of the game. Pompey would not allow Mark Antony to link up with Caesar without attempting an interception. He immediately broke camp and forced-marched his troops towards Antony, while Caesar marched his legions up the river until he found a point which was fordable. The rapid pace of Caesar ultimately deterred Pompey from continuing his attempt to intercept Mark Antony. So in order to avoid being trapped between the two contingents of his enemy, he retreated westward, camping his army north of the river Genesis, close to Asparagum, in a convenient situation. This war of movement would continue and be expanded upon by Caesar, who dispatched 3 of his subordinates to other operating theatres across the Greek mainland, one in Aetolia and the other to Thessaly, where they could organize vital grain convoys for their severely undersupplied legions. The third commander, Domitius Calvinus, was sent to intercept 2 legions who were fast approaching via Macedonia in order to reinforce Pompey. Caesar and Pompey were now facing each other across another river. These delaying tactics were immensely beneficial for Pompey, who could afford to fight a war of attrition, since his supply situation was far superior and his control of the sea routes was uncontested and complete. On the other hand, Caesar needed to force a swift conclusion to the hostilities and to entrain a striking and decisive blow to his enemy. Time was running against him. In typical Caesarian fashion, he adopted a diversionary tactic which was based on speed and surprise. He broke camp and marched his army eastwards with the intention to deceive Pompey and hide his true destination, who thought that he was simply trying to relocate his legions towards an area that would be supplied more easily. But when Caesar found a fordable area, he crossed his legions and immediately headed towards Dyrrachium through a ragged and concealed path. His objective, to cut off Pompey from the city he already knew was his main supply depot. The subterfuge was successful, and Caesar managed to beat Pompey to the coast, cutting off his enemy's communications, and he then proceeded to build a fortified camp to guard the road towards Dyrrachium. In this game of warfare, Caesar seemed to always be a step in front in comparison to his enemies. The two generals seemed to have settled down for a new and protracted stalemate. It was at this point that Caesar demonstrated his ability to think outside the box when he was up against a numerically superior enemy who was better supplied, but currently in no position and intention to engage with him in open battle. He needed to force Pompey's hand and simultaneously secure his position in order to be able to advance against the depot in Dyrrachium. So he resorted to a tactic that he had used before in Gaul with tremendous success. Taking into consideration the fact that Pompey's position was surrounded by rough and high hills, he occupied them, fortified key areas, and then began to draw a line of circumvallation around Pompey's position. We need not wonder about his intentions here and why he would choose such a complicated and labor-intensive method to deal with his enemy, since we are lucky enough to have Caesar's own account. His reasons were the following. Pompey was significantly stronger in cavalry, and he could use it to forage for grain and provisions without running any risk because of its superior mobility. So by confining his army within a narrow space, Caesar would both negate the ability of Pompey's cavalry to forage and render it militarily useless and difficult to sustain. And also there was another reason that was both psychological but also practical. Pompey's reputation throughout the empire would suffer deeply if it became known that he was confined and besieged by Caesar while he did not dare to hazard a battle. While Caesar was busy trying to expand his line of fortifications to confine Pompey within a compass as narrow as possible, Pompey saw and realized what was going on and immediately set into digging a line of fortifications within the line of Caesar in order to occupy as many hills as he could in as large a circuit as possible to prevent Caesar from blocking or surrounding him. As a result, the two armies fought a series of skirmishes while they were contesting certain areas or hills. Even though Pompey was determined not to come to a general engagement, he nonetheless frequently sent light troops in order to harass the Caesarians. By the time the two armies completed their fortifications, Caesar's lines were stretched to 24 kilometers and Pompey's lines were stretched just under 13 kilometers, even though Pompey managed to finish them first since he had greater manpower and a smaller compass to enclose. The two generals faced completely opposite situations now. Caesar was attempting to enclose a well-supplied and larger army with a smaller and thinly stretched one, while Pompey was hemmed in within an enclosed area without being able to maneuver or arrange his army as he saw fit. Of course, Pompey's large cavalry force and pack animals meant that the fodder was running out quickly, and soon his horses would be out of the battle, even though his ships were supplying him daily. Plus, there was a water shortage, since Caesar had diverted the course of every river or stream that was running through Pompey's lines. The sporadic skirmishing did not cease, especially at night, during which the Pompeians were frequently emerging from their trenches to pepper with arrows areas that were lighted by fires of Caesarians who were on guard. After a while, the Caesarians were accustomed to this and learned to light their fires at one place and keep guard at another. By the beginning of June, Pompey needed to break the stalemate. He somehow misinformed Caesar to believe that there was a faction within Dyrrachium that was ready to surrender the city to him. Caesar with a detachment marched towards Dyrrachium, but fell straight into a Pompeian ambush. Attacked from three sides simultaneously, he was forced to conduct an orderly retreat. At the same time, Pompey launched an all-out assault across Caesar's line of fortifications. It was a magnificent plan, and it probably would have worked if he wasn't up against an army of grizzled veterans who were defending a well-entrenched position on favorable ground. The Caesarians held until their general managed to return unharmed back to their lines. The whole struggle was desperate, as Caesar admits, even though his legions suffered superficial losses. 20 men in comparison with Pompey's 2,000. In one fort they counted 30,000 arrows which had been thrown, and in the shield of one centurion were found 230 holes. Caesar would attempt to force a battle every single day afterward. He drew up his army on a level ground and offered Pompey battle, being careful to advance his legionaries just before the range of Pompey's siege engines and light troops. Pompey would try to save face and would draw his legions within the range of his siege engines and light troops in front of his fortifications, but so close to them that his rear line would almost touch the rampart. At some point, something unexpected happened. 2 officers of Caesar's Gallic cavalry defected to Pompey and informed him of a certain weak position in Caesar's fortifications. At the southern end of his entrenched lines of ramparts, there was a gap and a place that wasn't connected with a transverse line between them. Pompey decided to strike there, and he would initiate what would prove to be the decisive engagement of the battle. At dusk of 9th of July, Pompey prepared an amphibious assault against the vulnerable position of the Caesarean fortification. He boarded a multitude of light and missile troops on board light galleys and attacked the position from 3 sides simultaneously. Backing this assault were 6 legions who managed to dislodge the defenders who were scattered and fled, facing overwhelming odds. The rest of the Caesarean army was alarmed by the system of smoke that was established for just such occasions. Mark Antony, followed by Caesar himself, arrived at the scene after a while. In between the now contested double ramparts and the Pompeian line of fortifications, there was an abandoned camp which was now occupied by the Pompeian assailants, which they expanded by adding an outer rampart, and in addition, Pompey had ordered the construction of a new camp outside the Caesarean enclosure. Seeing this, Caesar realized that he needed to act rapidly if he wanted to stop his opponent from securing and fortifying an opening from his enclosure from which his cavalry could easily forage and find fodder. He secretly gathered 33 cohorts, arranged them into 2 columns, and charged the fortified position of his enemy. The left wing of his attack column fell upon the unsuspecting Pompeians and managed to push them back, but the right wing followed along an extended palisade which led towards the river Lesnikia. That delay was crucial for the outcome of the engagement. After a while, they realized that the palisade was not an extension of the fortified camp, and they broke through within the narrow space between the camp and the river. Pompey, seeing the critical situation his army was facing, gathered 5 legions from the outer camp and immediately sent them to relieve his cornered defenders, ordering his cavalry to charge head-on the right wing of the Caesarean attack column while it was squeezing itself through the levelled palisades. The Caesarean cavalry, which was the first to break through the palisade, noticed the significantly stronger Pompeian cavalry charging straight towards them. Fearing they were going to be trapped between the palisades and the camp, they broke and fled. The panic spread to the infantry, and soon the right wing of the Caesareans was routed. The left wing, that was being successful up until that point, noticed what was happening and, fearing that it will be overwhelmed, broke and fled also. This cascade of panic was the critical point of the battle. Caesar's legionaries were crushed and squeezed through the choke points from which they came. The first legionaries who fell down a 10-feet-high ditch were trampled to death, and the rest fled for their lives. Even Caesar himself failed to stop the rout of his veterans, personally holding the legion's standard and urging them to stand their ground. According to Appian, the panic was so widespread that one signifier inverted his standard and tried to kill Caesar with it. A legionary from his German bodyguards was there and sliced off his hand, thus saving the general and changing the course of history. By the end of the engagement, the strategic initiative had shifted drastically in favor of Pompey, and Caesar, now realizing that his plan had failed and his siege lines were broken, ordered an immediate withdrawal so that his legions would be able to regroup. The casualty count was 32 centurions and tribunes, and 960 irreplaceable veterans for the Caesarean side. This would probably be the direst and most severe situation that Caesar ever faced. That day, the Caesareans abandoned their extensive fortifications and retreated southwards to regroup. The situation looked bleak for Caesar, but he wasn't over yet. (9th to the 10th of July, 48 BCE). Julius Caesar is retreating. It is something that he rarely did during his illustrious career. His plan to trap the Pompeians close to Dyrrhachium backfired spectacularly, and now his options were running out. The misfortunes for the Caesarians, though, did not end there, and it was around the same time that the Pompeians managed to catch half of Caesar's fleet at Messana, Sicily, and burn every single ship. Back in Epirus, Caesar was attempting a rapid retreat during the night. At dawn the next day, he had almost finished the crossing of the river Genesis when his rear guard clashed with the Pompeians, who were hot on their heels. The Caesarians fought bravely and managed to give Caesar enough time in order to finish the crossing. Once more the two armies faced each other across the same river, occupying the same old camps from months before. But Caesar did not intend on staying. He conducted a speedy retreat and managed to slip from Pompey's grasp, marching towards Apollonia, in which he left a small garrison. His plan was to force Pompey to march inland, away from his all-conquering fleet and his supply bases, and to unite with the remaining forces of Domitius Calvinus, who was facing off Pompey's reinforcements, commanded by Scipio. Pompey and Caesar were simultaneously marching against time. Caesar took a southern road up the valley of the river Ius, and Pompey took his familiar main Roman road of Via Egnatia, with quite opposite objectives from each other. Caesar was trying to link up with his general, while Pompey was attempting to surprise and annihilate him via a series of forced marches. By a stroke of luck, and just 4 hours before Pompey could trap him, Calvinus was informed of his arrival and immediately made a U-turn towards the south, barely escaping the Pompeian iron grip. Caesar and Calvinus united their armies near the city of Aeginium. The plain of Thessaly, with its fertile fields, lay before them. Caesar's main strategic goal was clear: capture the nearby cities and incorporate them to his supply lines. Marching southwards, the first city his legions encountered was Gomphi. The inhabitants of the city were encouraged by overinflated rumors of his defeat at Dyrrhachium to share Pompey's victory rather than be a part of Caesar's misfortunes. As he himself puts it in his commentaries, this defiance could not remain unpunished, and Caesar decided to make an example of the city by unleashing his veterans, who ransacked it. It was a practice that proved to be quite an effective incentive for the locals to collaborate, since after that almost all of Thessaly decided to side with Caesar. The next city in his way, Metropolis, surrendered to Caesar with a little encouragement by some captives from Gomphi. The Caesarian legions advanced further towards Thessaly, reaching the river Enipeus, near the city of Pharsalus. Meanwhile, Pompey, who advanced from Via Egnatia, made a right turn and headed southwards to the city of Larissa, in which the two legions commanded by Scipio were stationed. The Pompeian contingents united near the city and marched towards the plain of Pharsalus. When the army reached the hills overlooking the plain of Pharsalus, Pompey immediately understood that any further advance was pointless, since Caesar's army was blocking the road. The monumental clash of the two generals was imminent. It was a battle that would eventually decide the future of a whole empire and the course of Western civilization for the next centuries. While Caesar was already encamped in a convenient position near the bridge, controlling the passage to the city of Pharsalus, Pompey marched his army on a slope at the north edge of the plain, from which he could overlook the Caesarian positions, and upon which his legions were favorably placed in a strong defensive position. Caesar was running out of time. His supply situation was precarious, and his reputation had suffered a critical blow after the unfortunate conclusion of the Battle of Dyrrhachium. He still needed to force a swift conclusion to the hostilities, and his trust in his veterans did not budge at all, even after the debacle at Dyrrhachium. And he also had one distinctive and unique advantage in comparison to his enemy. While Pompey's word and command was in no way absolute and undisputed, since he was just first among equals with temporary and limited authority over the Republic's aristocrats, who were always trying to mingle and intervene with his command, Caesar's word and authority over his army and his generals was absolute, undisputed, and complete. Caesar would attempt to force a battle every day, marching out of his camp and arranging his legions in an aggressive manner, hoping that would convince his enemy to leave his defensive position and face him in a single, decisive engagement. But Pompey, not willing to abandon the safety of his hills, would draw out his army, but just at the end of the slope, bordering the northern part of the plain. The great rogue general demonstrated his elaborate thinking into his own account of the battle, proving that each move that he made was totally deliberate and nothing was left to chance. By marching daily his legions closer and closer to Pompey's camp, he slowly boosted the morale of his men and made them accustomed to this kind of battle. He specifically knew that if he was to succeed in a potential clash with the Republican forces, his men would have to face the, by many degrees, numerically superior cavalry of the Pompeians. So he intermixed with his own cavalry a selected group of the youngest and most active men of the vanguard, and instilled them, by this daily practice, with a lack of fear and a contempt for Pompey's numerical superiority. After many days of this military ballet, Caesar gave up hope, and he did not believe that Pompey was willing to risk everything in a single battle against his hardened veterans. Nonetheless, against his better judgment, and at the exact day that he intended to break camp and march out, something unexpected happened. On the morning of August the 9th, or the 7th of June by the modern calendar, Pompey's arrangement shifted from its usual alignment and advanced further than usual from its entrenchments. Caesar, after no long deliberation, understood that the time had come. He immediately addressed himself to his soldiers when they were at the gates of the camp, ready to march out. "We must defer our march at present and set our thoughts on battle, which has been our constant wish. Let us then meet the foe with resolute souls. We shall not hereafter easily find such an opportunity." On the other side of the field, Pompey was confident that his all-conquering and massive cavalry force would be the key for victory. The two armies treaded towards each other in a machine-like manner. Pompey's army was composed of 47,000 legionaries, or 110 cohorts at their full strength. Some auxiliaries and a few cohorts remained to guard his camp. His cavalry was commanded by a Caesarian former officer who defected to the Pompeian side, Titus Labienus. His left wing was commanded by him personally. There he placed 2 legions that were delivered over by Caesar at the beginning of his disputes with the Senate in compliance with one of their decrees. Scipio with the Syrian legions commanded the center, and his right wing was commanded by Afranius. There Pompey placed what he deemed as his most trusted legions that would include the Cilician legion in conjunction with some cohorts that he managed to salvage from Spain. Caesar's order of battle was the following. On his left wing, he placed the 9th and 8th Legion, even though the 9th was so weakened by the Battle of Dyrrhachium that he placed the 8th Legion pretty close to the 9th, as to almost make one of the two, and he gave the command to Antonius. The center was under the command of Calvinus, and the right wing was under the direct command of Sulla. Caesar himself was positioned just behind the right wing, opposite to his rival, and close to his best and most reliable legion, the 10th. His small cavalry force, together with all of his slingers and light troops, were placed opposite to Pompey's cavalry. And at the last moment, Caesar drew a single cohort from every legion in his third line and made a concealed fourth line with the task to stab the cavalrymen of Pompey with their pillar once they broke through. He knew the outcome of the battle would be decided here. In total, 80 cohorts made up 9 legions, or 22,000 men, arranged in the typical triplex axis Roman formation of the period. A couple of cohorts were left behind to guard their camp. Moments after Caesar gave the signal to charge, a centurion of renowned bravery from his elite 10th legion, named Crastinus, saluted him and said, "General, I will act in such a manner today that you will feel grateful to me, living or dead." And with such high spirits, Caesar's outnumbered veterans charged against Pompey's numerically superior, but mostly inexperienced recruits. But the Pompeians would not move, and decided to stand their ground and receive Caesar's charge, with their lines unbroken. The Caesarian veterans were accustomed to this, and being practiced in former battles, they halted almost midway, redressed their ranks, and renewed their charge, threw their pila, and instantly drew their swords, clashing against the Pompeian line. At the same time, Pompey's cavalry began its charge. Almost 7,000 horses, followed by archers and slingers, were moving as a single block against the massively outnumbered Caesarian cavalry. The Caesarians did not withstand their charge, but expectedly gave ground a little. At that moment, Julius Caesar gave the signal to his fourth hidden line, and they charged, holding their pila high and stabbing the Pompeians into their faces. In Caesar's words, "They rushed with such fury that not a man of them stood, but all wheeling about, not only quitted their post, but galloped forward to seek a refuge in the highest mountains. By their retreat, the archers and slingers, being left destitute and defenseless, were all cut to pieces." It was the turning point of the battle. Pompey's plan had completely backfired, and his hammer was now being chased off the field. The victorious fourth line wheeled about upon Pompey's unprotected left wing while it was still engaged, and it was now that Caesar gave the order to his third line to advance. The Pompeians fought bravely, but without the support of their cavalry, being pushed from the front and attacked from their flank and their rear, and with the arrival of Caesar's fresh third line, they broke and began to flee for their lives. It was really like rolling a carpet after that, with the Republican left flank being the first to break, and the rest followed. Pompey would not stay to share the fate of his legionaries, and he fled towards the camp. He gave orders to some cohorts and auxiliaries to protect the ramparts, and withdrew to his tent, waiting for the outcome of the battle. The victorious Caesarians pushed on towards the camp and made short work of the defenders who could not withstand the multitude of projectiles that were thrown against them. The defenders and the survivors abandoned any further effort to protect the camp and fled to the nearby hills, leaving the victorious Caesarians to occupy it. When Pompey heard that Caesar's troops were able to force the gates, he is supposed to have exclaimed, "What? Into the very camp?" It was a total victory for Julius Caesar. The magnitude of his triumph would only become obvious until after the casualties from both sides were accounted. Pompey's army was completely devastated. With 15,000 dead and 25,000 captured, the Republican army was essentially wiped out, while Caesar himself informs us that he only lost 230 men, amongst which there lay the valiant Crastinus, who was killed fighting bravely by a sword thrust to his mouth. The remaining Republicans who fled to the nearby hills were surrounded by the Caesarians and surrendered the next day. Pompey, who had fled towards the coast, boarded a ship and sailed to Alexandria. He would be assassinated within a few months, while Caesar was left the absolute master of the Roman Empire. After he decisively defeated Pompey in the Battle of Pharsalus, Caesar did not linger for long and went after his arch-rival to Alexandria. There he was greeted by a reluctant and scheming court, which presented him the severed head of Pompey. Despite being victorious in a civil war much closer to home, Caesar did not have too much idle time on his hands. Having been embroiled in prolonged Egyptian court intrigue and quelling a serious uprising of the local population, more recently he faced another insurrection in Asia Minor against Pharnaces II of Pontus. Caesar was able to successfully conclude the campaign in Asia Minor in just a few days, but this brief window of time was enough for the opposition leadership in Africa to consolidate their forces and allies, and to gather enough strength to renew the conflict. Cato, Labienus, Afranius, Scipio, and many other prominent optimates were able to form 10 legions and ensure valuable support of King Euba of Numidia, who was able to provide an army that was the equivalent of 4 legions, and he also brought his elite light Numidian cavalry, as well as 120 war elephants. Caesar needed to act quickly. By the time he reached Italy, many of his veteran legions, including his beloved 10th, were mutinous and were demanding to be demobilized after years of active service. It was a situation that became worse due to his long absence in Egypt and Asia Minor. But yet again he displayed a crucial gift, common in great commanders of men: his perfect grasp of his troops' psychology. Caesar agreed to their demands, declaring that all of their desires would be granted once he had won the war in Africa with the help of other legions, all the while addressing his veterans not as comrades, but as Quirites, which were just ordinary civilians. This bit of reverse psychology made even his most battle-hardened veterans feel ashamed. The mutineers, and especially troops from the 10th Legion, were soon begging Caesar to take them back into his service. Now that the mutiny was resolved, it was time to deal with the optimates in Africa. Caesar impatiently rushed towards Sicily with a single legion, wishing to face his enemies as soon as possible. Unfortunately for him, bad weather forced him to postpone his departure to North Africa. While waiting, he ordered his tent to be pitched on the beach to make a point of how eager and confident he was to embark on a journey against his enemies. Finally, on the 25th of December 47 BC, he set sail for Africa. But hasty planning of the expedition meant that he was able to take only 6 legions and 2,000 cavalry, and there was almost no effort to properly scout the landing area. Once again in his career, Caesar's sea crossing was a dramatic affair, as unexpected winds scattered his fleet in multiple directions. The African coast came in sight not far from Hadrumetum. The city was occupied by a large garrison, so with only a fraction of the troops at his disposal, Caesar could only wait until more of his galleys converged near the flagship. After a few hours, he eventually disembarked near the city with a meager force of 3,000 foot and 150 horse. With his logistical situation critical, Caesar used his small force to expand his operational base and attain a firmer foothold on Africa. Marching along the coast, He was soon met with multiple delegations from various coastal cities that were offering to supply and help him in any way that they could. Once at the city of Ruspina, he raised a fortified camp. With his base established, Caesar marched on and reached the free city of Leptis. There, the deputies of the town offered their unconditional help and collaboration. While in the city, by sheer chance, some of the lost galleys found their way to the harbour. From the crews, Caesar learned that the rest of his fleet was unsure which course to pursue, and decided to sail for Utica. The Roman general garrisoned Leptis with 6 cohorts and marched back to Ruspina. He left the remainder of his small force in the fortified camp, and on the following night went on a reconnaissance mission in order to find out the whereabouts of the rest of his army. His lucky star shined bright that night, as the rest of his fleet unexpectedly appeared in view just before daybreak. Reunited with the remainder of his forces, Caesar marched back to his fortified camp. The next task was finding supplies, as the sudden appearance of the rest of his troops put an extra weight on his already strained logistics. A contingent of 30 cohorts, some 9,000 strong, along with a small force of cavalry, advanced out into the country without their baggage to forage. Caesar had not marched more than 3 miles from his camp when he was informed by his scouts that enemy forces were in sight. As soon as the announcement was made, a big cloud of dust appeared in the distance. He immediately ordered his small force of 400 cavalry and 150 archers to march forward in order to cover his infantry, with explicit instructions to avoid being enveloped. And, in a rare move, he deployed his legions into a single line due to the small size of his force. The enemy army was comprised mainly of light Numidian cavalry and a few foot skirmishers under the command of his former deputy, Titus Labienus. In total, the Numidians numbered around 11,500 men. Labienus had arranged his cavalry in such close order that Caesar mistook them for infantry, so when he suddenly began to extend his line, the Caesarians were caught off guard. As the light Numidian cavalry advanced, Caesar's archers were forced to retreat, but at the same time a few cohorts broke ranks and charged against the approaching Numidians. The light cavalry retreated immediately, while the Numidian infantry advanced and launched their missiles at the unshielded right side of the Roman infantry. Labienus now gave the order, and by using his overwhelming superiority in numbers, he pushed back the outnumbered Caesarian cavalry that was guarding the flanks. The fast-moving Numidians used their superior numbers to encircle the enemy, as no other was available to block their advance. For once, Caesar was completely enveloped and tactically outmatched. The situation was made worse by the fact that his legionnaires were not the battle-hardened veterans of Gaul and Pharsalus, but mostly raw recruits. It was his charisma and reputation alone that averted certain disaster, as he persuaded the men to hold their nerve. Caesar forbade his men to advance beyond the signifiers and arranged his army so as to face both sides. The heavy-armored legionnaires were incapable of dealing with this method of fighting, since they couldn't catch up either with the light infantry nor with the Numidian cavalry, while the Numidians could shower them with projectiles without engaging them in close quarters. At this moment, Labienus advanced in front of the battle line without his helmet and began taunting the Caesarians, mocking their severe situation and their lack of experience. A legionary from Caesar's ranks replied, "I am not of your raw warriors, but a veteran of the 10th Legion." "Where is your standard?" Labienus shouted back. "I will soon make you sensible to who I am," answered the soldier. Then, pulling off his helmet to reveal himself, he threw a pilum with all his strength, wounding Labienus's horse, which threw him on the ground. The soldier warned, "Know that this javelin was thrown by a soldier of the 10th Legion." The wounded Labienus was carried from the field. Despite the heroic display of the veteran, Caesar's green troops were wary, and one standard-bearer attempted to abandon his position, forcing Caesar to grab him by the shoulder, turn him around and say, "Look, that's where the enemy are." With dusk approaching, Caesar tried to break the encirclement and withdraw his army into his fortified camp. He gave orders to most of his cohorts and his cavalry to suddenly charge against the Numidians, hoping that the surprise attack would give them enough time to break out and retreat. The concentrated push caught the Numidians unawares, and their formations scattered in confusion. A brief skirmish ensued, but the light cavalrymen disengaged soon after, and the Romans attempted a rapid march towards their fortifications. With daylight diminishing, the Caesarian columns were in the process of retreating when a new detachment of 1,100-strong Numidian cavalry, commanded by Marcus Petreius, fell upon Caesar's rear guard. Caesar ordered his cavalry and a contingent of legionnaires to aid the embattled troops in the rear and buy time for the rest of the army to reach the camp. The countercharge was successful, and the Numidians retreated, and their commander was wounded in the fighting. After a long and hard-fought retreat, Caesar's exhausted legionnaires made their way to the fortified camp. Casualties for both sides are unknown, but they were probably not too severe. At Raspina, Caesar almost lost everything, and it was only because of his quick thinking and his good luck that he was able to survive through this predicament, to fight another day. The decisive engagement in Africa was yet to come. Raspina was a close call for Julius Caesar. Not only was he incapable of delivering a decisive blow to the apparently crumbling cause of his senatorial enemies, but he was lucky to escape with his army unscathed. After he barely fended off the forces of the Optimates at the Battle of Raspina, Caesar was still in a logistical predicament, and his naval supply routes were flimsy and unsecured at best, with his soldiers improvising heavily and even resorting to feeding their horses and cattle with seaweed in order to sustain them. At the same time, Metellus Scipio, the commander-in-chief of the Optimates, began marching from Utica with the entire army in order to assist Labienus and intercept Caesar. Caesar's situation was critical. His hasty sea crossing with a small force meant that he could neither properly secure a bridgehead for his incoming supplies, nor could he hope to use his army as his main strategic tool, which forced him to dig in and endure a defensive standoff. At the same time, he sent messages to his allies in Sicily, ordering them to immediately dispatch ships with the rest of his army and the much-needed provisions. Caesar and Scipio were facing each other across the North African plain, but even though Scipio had a significant numerical advantage, he would not dare to directly charge Caesar's fortifications, something that Caesar was aware of. While he was biding his time, numerous delegations from coastal cities came to Caesar and either offered their services or pleaded with him to protect their cities from the cruelty of his enemy. This was a perfect opportunity for Caesar to expand his operational and logistical base. So when several deputies from the neighboring city of Acylla requested from him a garrison that would assist them against the incursions of Scipio's army, he immediately dispatched C. Messius with a few cohorts in order to take control of the town. Soon after he entered the city, though, Messius was besieged by Considius Longus with a legion and few cavalry. During this slow and methodic game of strategic movements, Caesar was once more a step ahead of his enemy, forcing Scipio to play catch-up by responding to his maneuvers. Amidst this standstill, Caesar's proconsul from Sicily was able to at last send him 2 more legions, the 13th and 14th, together with a strong detachment of Gallic horsemen. The reinforcements arrived safely to Raspina and bolstered the pinned Caesarian army. The timing was vital because the 2 legions were composed of many of Caesar's experienced veterans, and their arrival rejuvenated the demoralized and outnumbered raw levies that made up the bulk of his army. With the determination of his troops renewed, Caesar began taking the initiative. Scipio's camp was placed upon a ridge nearby, and Caesar saw an opportunity to gain a strategic advantage over his enemy by occupying the eminences. After a series of skirmishes, mainly between light troops and cavalry, Caesar again diverted his actions and in battle array marched along the hills, obviously aiming to occupy the nearby city of Userta. And Scipio could not afford to lose Userta. It was a vital logistical depot and his main source of water supplies. So he immediately marched to aid the city, determined to defend it at all costs. Caesar's unconventional approach to warfare would be something that his enemy would soon be forced to face. With his outnumbered army, and with no hope of surprising or outflanking Scipio, Caesar needed to overcome both his numerical and topographical disadvantage. So he set his main camp upon a hill opposite to Userta, and began extending 2 lines of ditches straight towards each side of the city. By this labor-intensive method, which was typical for Caesar, he intended to protect both of his flanks, while attempting to occupy the city with a direct frontal assault. And as he began extending his siege works, King Juba of Numidia came to the aid of Scipio, with a substantial force of cavalry and light infantry, as well as numerous war elephants and 3 legions under his command. The stakes were getting higher by the minute. A series of skirmishes ensued upon the ridges and eminences around the city between the 2 generals, with Labienus having a prominent role during the numerous cavalry engagements that followed. While those hostilities were carrying on around Userta, 2 more legions that were sent from Sicily managed to arrive safely at Raspina, the 9th and the elite 10th Legion. And the timing could not have been more crucial. With his army reinforced by 2 veteran legions, the entrenching was accelerated, and it wasn't long before Caesar was able to extend his fortification so close to Userta to have it within range of his siege engines. This gave the opportunity to numerous local kings, officers, and high-ranking officials that were sympathetic to Caesar, but forced to follow Scipio, to defect under the cover of darkness and reach his fortifications carrying with them crucial intelligence, offering their help and collaboration. On a daily basis, Caesar would attempt to provoke Scipio into a full-scale battle against his hardened veterans by arranging his army in battle order within full view of the enemy army, assuming an aggressive formation and marching just a few hundred paces in front of Scipio's fortifications. He remained so posted from morning till night without fighting, because neither Scipio dared to advance within the narrow entrenched area where his army could not maneuver, nor would Caesar forfeit the protection that the fortifications offered to his army's flanks. As a result, the opposing cavalry forces would engage in daily skirmishes around the fortifications, with the Caesarians trying to fend off the Scipiones, who were desperately attempting to deter their enemy from expanding the ramparts and completely cutting them off. Meanwhile, Considius Longus, after besieging Acylla for a protracted period of time, realized that he would not be able to storm the city's defenses, so he dispersed his forces and abandoned the siege. But things would not remain so smooth for Caesar for much longer. During the standoff with Scipio's forces, he received urgent news that many of his transport ships that were anchored outside Leptus had been raided by nearby enemy troops, and many of them were burned. With his lines of communication now severely threatened, he decided to directly command the naval operations against the enemy fleet. After he successfully combined most of his scattered vessels into a single force, he then proceeded to attack the fleet that was stationed close to Hadrumetum. The surprise was complete, and most of the enemy's ships that could not withdraw to the safety of the harbor were burned. Caesar managed to resolve this crisis in record time. It seemed that wherever he was able to personally intervene, everything worked out in his favor. This Midas touch that he had on the battlefield was a unique trait that would consistently follow him throughout his military career. But despite all of his efforts, Caesar's logistical situation was still critical. When he returned to his main camp, he decided to abandon his attempts to storm the city of Userta and resume the war of movement. At dawn he gathered all of his legions and, after setting fire to his main camp, marched off towards Agar. There he encamped on the plain before the town and went with a part of his army around the country in search of provisions. Scipio, meanwhile, hearing of Caesar's departure, followed him along the hills with all of his forces and posted himself about 6 miles off. If Caesar couldn't dislodge his enemy, he would attempt to outpace him. Thus, when he received intelligence from a spy that Scipio was out in the countryside foraging, he saw an opportunity to occupy the nearby strategically placed city of Zeta. Under the cover of darkness, he force-marched his army past the enemy's camp and occupied the town right under the nose of his enemies. And when he realized that Scipio was further down the countryside foraging, he immediately set out to intercept him. But almost immediately it became apparent that most of Scipio's army was already alarmed of Caesar's presence and was hastily heading to aid their foraging comrades. Caesar's force was not prepared for a full-scale battle under these circumstances, with a large portion of his legions left to garrison his main camp, and, being in a field that he did not choose, he would not risk it, so he disengaged and attempted a rapid retreat. As he drew near the enemy camp from which he was obliged to pass, Labienus and Afrianius were laying in ambush among the nearby hills with a strong detachment of Numidian light cavalry. The rear guard of Caesar's veterans immediately faced about and prepared to receive the charge of the enemy cavalry. But as soon as they attempted to countercharge them, they fled back into the hills. It was apparent that the cavalry of the Optimates was attempting to harass and delay Caesar's retreat and oblige him to encamp at a place where no water was to be had. The situation that Caesar faced is described perfectly in one of our sources, where it is mentioned that Caesar, to meet enemies of this sort, was necessitated to instruct his soldiers, not like a general of a veteran army which had been victorious in so many battles, but like a fencing master training up his gladiators, with what foot they must advance or retire, when they were to oppose and make good their ground, when to counterfeit an attack, at what place, and in what manner to launch their javelins. This march had already lasted from 3 in the morning to 4 in the afternoon, and with Caesar's legionnaires exhausted and the retreat almost coming to a halt due to constant enemy harassment, he needed to find a way out of this predicament. Realizing that by keeping his cavalry in the rear, he kept losing horses which he could not easily replace, so he instead positioned contingents of his veteran legionnaires as his rear guard, with specific orders to receive and repulse the enemy's constant charges. This tactic proved to be effective, and by retreating in a methodical and slow manner, Caesar's army was at last able to reach the camp safely just before sunset, after sustaining only a few casualties. The next day, Caesar tried to induce Scipio into a full-scale battle by deploying his army in battle order outside his camp, but Scipio wouldn't budge and remained lodged in his camp on the nearby hills. But the tactic of taunting his enemy remained unsuccessful, and Caesar resumed the warfare of rapid marches that his veterans were accustomed to, and directed his army towards the nearby city of Sarsura, where there was a magazine of wheat. His legions were constantly harassed by the light cavalry of Scipio along the way, but this time Caesar was prepared. By assigning 300 legionnaires from each legion with the special task of rapid intervention against the enemy's rear guard action, he was able to successfully counter the incursions of Labienus's cavalry and to reach Sarsura, which he occupied by destroying the enemy garrison. The next day, Caesar resumed his march against the nearby town of Tisra, but this time, due to the city's stronger defenses and the logistical difficulties that a potential siege would entail, he abandoned the attempt to capture it and returned back to his old camp near Agar. Between the two camps was a small town by the name of Tegea, in which Scipio retained a small garrison that he intended to assist. After yet another small and indecisive skirmish between the opposing cavalry and light infantry, the stalemate could not be broken. Caesar could not entice Scipio to abandon his favorable and well-defended position near the city of Tegea, but neither could he afford to endure a prolonged siege, because being so far away from his main coastal supply depots imposed many difficulties. However, the apparent lack of an overall strategic objective for Scipio played into Caesar's hand. The veteran general had a unique insight when it came to a warfare of movement and strategic planning. Caesar once again found himself in need of a decisive battle that his enemy was not willing to give, so he came up with a plan that would play into all of his and his army's strengths. Rapid movement, keen insight when it came to topographic considerations, a well-defined military objective, and the boundless capacity of his legionnaires for hard and unremitting labor. Under the cover of night, he broke camp and marched straight against the coastal city of Thapsus that was occupied by a well-known general of the Optimates, C. Virgilius. Thapsus was already besieged by C, and would now become the incentive for the decisive battle that Caesar needed so much. When Caesar arrived, he immediately set his legionnaires to dig a series of ditches and ramparts around the whole town in order to cut it off and prevent any succors from reaching it. Scipio could not afford the disgrace of abandoning both Virgilius and the Thapsitani, who were loyal all along to the cause of the Optimates. When he received news of Caesar's designs, he immediately marched his army towards Thapsus and camped just 8 miles away from the city, opposite to Caesar's siege works. It is not exactly clear how long it took, but it's obvious from the ancient sources that within a few days, Caesar's legions were able to completely surround Thapsus with an elaborate double network of ditches, ramparts, and a few strategically positioned forts. Surrounded and completely cut off by both land and sea, the Thapsitani were doomed unless Scipio could break the encirclement. The next day, Scipio left his fort and advanced a few miles closer to Caesar, just off the range of his siege engines. His army was arranged in battle order and was facing the Caesarians that were now clearly in sight. Caesar noticed this movement and drew off most of his army from the works in order to face the enemy, left a small garrison to guard the forts, and gave specific instructions to his fleet to raise a shout on his signal so as to distract Virgilius's forces in case his legions were engaged in battle. Caesar drew up his army in 3 lines. On his right wing he placed the 10th and 2nd legions of veterans, the 8th and 9th legions on his left wing, and in his center he positioned 5 more legions. He also placed the 5th legion, which was split in 2 halves, to guard his flanks, and entrusted it to deal with the enemy elephants. His cavalry was positioned on both of his wings, intermixed with archers and light troops. The opposing army of Scipio was drawn up similarly with 3 lines of infantry and his cavalry and light troops on both wings. But he also had positioned his numerous elephants in front of his main battle line for shock value and intimidation. Scipio hoped that with his elephants he could create enough havoc within Caesar's lines once the battle commenced, and had them specifically trained to endure the sound of slings and arrows. All told, Scipio deployed approximately 12 legions at Thapsus, including a strong contingent of light Numidian cavalry, commanded by King Juba. Caesar went from rank to rouse the spirits of his veterans, reminding them of their former victories and animating them with his expressions. He exhorted the new recruits who had never seen battle before to emulate the courage and endurance of the veterans, and endeavor to attain the same degree of glory and renown for themselves. As he ran from rank to rank, he noticed that the army of Scipio was in turmoil, with a portion of it still working on the fortifications of their new camp, and many others being very uneasy, hurrying from place to place, or retiring behind the ramparts, while others came out again in confusion. As many others from his army began to observe this, Caesar's officers and centurions beseeched and implored their general to give the order for an all-out attack. His veterans of the renowned 10th Legion, who so often were at the forefront of his triumphs, were especially uneasy and chafing at the bit to launch against their enemies. As Caesar did not wish to commence a battle by a sudden charge, he tried to restrain the eagerness of the men and mitigate their aggressive impulses. But despite his best efforts, all of a sudden a trumpeter on the right wing, who was compelled by the fuming veterans of his 10th Legion, sounded the charge. The small trickle of furiously attacking veterans soon became a flood, and neither the centurions nor Caesar himself were able to stop them. Caesar understood that the enthusiasm of his soldiers could not be restrained, and after wishing them good luck, he spurred on his horse and joined them in the charge. The explosive onslaught of the veterans gave Scipio little time to respond. Caesar's archers and light troops showered the opposing elephants with their darts and arrows in such a way that the animals panicked, turned about, and trampled their own troops who were still within the ramparts of the camp. Soon afterwards, the Caesarian right wing enveloped their surprised enemies and occupied the camp. The ferocity of the attack is captured by an instance described in one of our sources. A veteran of the 5th Legion who, after witnessing the horrific mangling of a camp follower by an elephant, charged the animal by himself. When the elephant grabbed him with his trunk, he still did not panic, but retained the presence of mind to brand his sword and wound the elephant's trunk. Miraculously, the animal eased its grab, released him, and fled. Soon the battle turned into a rout, and the Optimates were running for their lives. Caesar's veterans managed to kill almost 10,000 enemy legionnaires, while their own losses are described as being negligible, ranging from 50 to almost 1,000 men. The unstoppable Caesarian advance chased off the opposing Scipiones from their left towards their right flank, and soon the veterans occupied both enemy camps. The fleeing rabble could not pose a threat any longer to the triumphant leader of the Populares. The African campaign was all but won. The Battle of Thapsus was a unique instance of Caesar completely losing control of his army. Nevertheless, the sheer guts, experience, and ferocity of his veterans still gave him a total and decisive victory. All seemed lost for the scattered Optimates, with North Africa, Italy, Asia Minor, and Greece under the iron grip of the Caesarians. Now, Spain remained the only refuge for the Optimates. It's early in the year 46 BC. After the decisive defeat at Thapsus, all seemed lost for the Optimates. Most of their prominent members were either dead or fleeing. A large portion of their armies was either destroyed or captured, while any remaining troops scattered. But despite all of these disastrous setbacks, the old political order of Rome proved to be a very hard nut to crack. The Optimates will soon prove that they still have some fight left in them. Two of Pompey Magnus's sons, Gnaeus and Sextus, together with Titus Labienus, a former Caesarian who turned against him, managed to escape the Caesar's onslaught after their defeat at Thapsus. They made their way to Spain and slowly began to recruit new legions in order to, once more, renew the hostilities against their nemesis. A couple of Pompey's former veteran legions that were stationed in Hispania Ulteria had declared themselves for the Optimates, and drove out Caesar's proconsul. Those two legions were soon joined by the remnants of the army that was defeated in the North African campaign. By combining their forces, they managed to occupy most of the province, including the capital, Corduba. It didn't take long after that for the Optimates to swell their ranks with newly recruited levies from Roman citizens of the region and from local Spanish inhabitants, as well as former slaves who were disillusioned with Caesarian authorities. Caesar again had a full-scale crisis on his hands. The civil war has resurged within just a few months after his victory at Thapsus. But this time around, the leader of the Populares faced unique issues. Most of his veterans, after years of service and numerous campaigns, were disbanded and retired. The majority of his loyal and so often victorious veterans would not follow their general to Spain. Nevertheless, Caesar's favorite and most loyal legion, the 10th, despite being severely under strength due to years of campaigning and accumulated losses, together with the 5th Legion, that so successfully managed to counter the attack of the enemy elephants during the Battle of Thapsus, were amongst those who would follow Caesar to what would ultimately prove to be his final campaign. Caesar arrived in Spain in early December 46 BC, after an epic march of almost 2,400 kilometers, which his army covered in less than a month, a march that, according to some ancient sources, Caesar commemorated in a short poem that he wrote. When his presence became known to the region, many ambassadors approached him with a variety of requests. The ambassadors from Corduba urged him to march straight to their city and relieve it from the enemy, who they claimed was not yet aware of his presence. But at the same time, survivors from the garrison of Ulia, beseeching Caesar to relieve the city that was under siege by Gnaeus Pompey for some months now. Caesar thought it more prudent to march to relieve Ulia first, since its citizens remained loyal under pressure. He detached 11 cohorts with a small cavalry force, under the command of Julius Paisiessus, and sent them during the night to lift the siege of Ulia. When the detachment arrived near Ulia, a severe tempest arose that reduced visibility to within just a few meters. Thinking quickly, Paisiessus ordered his men to attempt to sneak from within Pompey's entrenchments, marching with his cavalry in a very thin formation. After a Pompeian guard became aware of their presence and required them to identify themselves, one of Paisiessus's legionnaires yelled at him to be silent, telling him that they were attempting to capture the walls. The trick worked, and the Caesarians managed to enter the city. Thanks to Paisiessus's cunning and the audacity of a single legionnaire, the siege of Ulia was lifted. When Caesar received news of this success, he immediately set off towards Corduba. He quickly built a bridge and forded the river Calda Severe, setting his camp not far from the city. Pompey rushed to intercept Caesar and set his camp just opposite of his rival's position, across the bridge. As was typical for Caesar, he attempted to completely block off his enemy from gaining access to the bridge by having his soldiers dig an extended trench from his camp. As a result, a series of bloody skirmishes ensued across the bridge. The Pompeians tried to gain access to the bridge, and the Caesarians tried to block it off. So severe were the losses for both sides due to the narrow space in which they fought, that heaps of bodies piled up on both sides of the bridge. Caesar realized that Pompey would not commit to an open and decisive battle, so he did not linger for long. He instructed his soldiers to light many fires to distract and deceive the enemy into thinking that the entire force was in the camp. Then, during that same night, he forded the river and marched against the city of Ategua, which was the strongest fort that the Optimates had in the area. The veterans immediately began to besiege the town of Ategua, forcing the new recruits to follow their lead and accustom themselves with the heavy workload that was typical of the Caesarian way of waging war. It wasn't long after that a series of ditches and ramparts had fully surrounded the town. Around the same time, Pompey, who was informed of Caesar's departure and was marching to the aid of Ategua, happened to stumble upon a strong detachment of enemy cavalry during some heavy mist and completely destroyed it. Despite his success, most of the strategic eminences around the area were already occupied by Caesarians, so he was forced to bypass them and encamp himself in between Ategua and the nearby city of Eucubus, upon some hills overlooking the enemy positions. From his position, Pompey could not assist the defenders, so was in urgent need of a plan. After he assessed the situation, he came up with a plan of immediate action. There, across a nearby river, he saw a weakly defended hill that overlooked the town, as well as Caesar's communication lines, and, because of the nature of the ground and the intervening river, he thought that Caesar would not be able to reinforce the position in case of a surprise attack. Driven by this belief, he sent a strong detachment in a dramatic night march to storm the enemy's position and dislodge the Caesarians. Things did not go according to Pompey's plan, though. When his legionnaires reached the position, the defenders were ready and showered them with their pila from a favorable and elevated position. With the surprise being unsuccessful, the ensuing skirmish gave enough time to Caesar to react. 3 legions from the main camp rushed to the aid of their comrades, and the Pompeians were caught in between the two forces. After a brief struggle, the Pompeians fled after losing about 100 men during the flight. The losses would have probably been more severe if the attack happened during daylight. After the failure of the surprise attack, Pompey changed his tactics and attempted to force his way across the river and onto the strategically located hill. He began digging a line across his camp to the nearby river in order for his army to be able to safely reach the other side. Once again, skirmishes ensued around the entrenchments, but Pompey's army was eventually able to reach the river and even build a new fort on the opposite bank. The no-man's land between the two opposing fortifications became a place of severe and intense clashes, with neither side being able to achieve a major victory, and both armies sustained minor setbacks. Pompey needed to break the stalemate and relieve the town from his enemy. During the night, he managed to sneak messages to the besieged, imploring them to assemble and attack a specific point of Caesar's fortifications, in the hope that they could break out and unite with his forces outside. The garrison of Ategua complied and tried a desperate breakthrough out of Caesar's chokehold, but the effort was in vain. The Caesarian army proved to be way too prepared and capable of repulsing the attempt. After a brief clash, in which the garrison sustained heavy losses, it was eventually forced to retreat in disarray back within its walls. After the failed breakthrough attempt, Pompey decided that he could do nothing more for the besieged. Preparations began to break camp and march towards the western part of the province, where there were numerous well-defended allied cities and towns that he could assist and defend more effectively. Caesar intercepted this intelligence and decided to inform the inhabitants of the besieged city about Pompey's decision to abandon them. And, as he had correctly predicted, it didn't take long before a letter arrived from Governor L. Menatius, who offered to surrender the town as long as he received guarantees that their lives would be spared, which Caesar granted. The siege of Ategua was successfully concluded in February of 45 BC. The fall of this key fortress incited a cascade of defections around the whole province in favor of Caesar's cause. Pompey was retreating towards the city of Aucubus, and Caesar remained hot on his heels. After crossing yet another river close to Aucubus, Pompey decided to encamp yet again and began entrenching himself on defendable hilly area. The two armies were soon engaged in a ferocious skirmish near the fordable area of the river, during which the Caesarians were overwhelmed and pushed back. Two of Caesar's veteran centurions made a heroic last stand in an attempt to slow down the Pompeian countercharge. Their eventual deaths gave enough time to the opposing Caesarian horsemen, who were rushing out of their camp to intervene, and in their turn drove the Pompeians back to their own entrenchments. Both adversaries were carefully maneuvering, attempting to defend their lines, while at the same time endeavoring to exploit any weakness and strike a knockout blow to the enemy. After marching a few miles westwards, both armies stopped and began to dig in. Pompey encamped just outside the city of Aucubus, and Caesar a few miles to the north. He immediately set his legionnaires to dig a protracted ditch along the communication and supply routes of his enemy that ran towards the city of Aspavia, just off to the north of his position. After Pompey observed this, he immediately perceived the seriousness of the situation and decided to hazard an engagement against the Caesarian forces. But he remained wary and cautious enough to march along the hills and attempt to provoke an engagement from a favorable, elevated position. The exact description of what happened next is lost to us, but it is reasonable to assume that Caesar's forces managed to dislodge the Pompeians from their position, and that they were only saved by the onset of darkness. It was around that time that letters sent from Pompey to his allies in nearby cities were intercepted. In them he described a switch in his strategy, and that from now on he would attempt to defend every allied city, intending to hinder Caesar's army from using them as supply depots and provision sources that it so desperately needed. Pompey continued to retreat to the western side of the province, and Caesar followed him closely, managing to capture the city of Ventisponte during the pursuit. The commander of the Optimates, being faithful to his aforementioned strategy, has set out to enact it, burning the nearby city of Caruca when its garrison refused to open the gates to him, and from there marching southwards to the nearby town of Munda, where he positioned his army upon the mountainous area to the immediate vicinity of the town. Caesar, still on the pursuit, arrived in the plains of Munda and pitched his camp opposite to that of Pompey. The next day, while Caesar was preparing to once again set out with his army, scout reports stated that Pompey's army was arranged in battle order ever since midnight. Julius Caesar ordered for the battle standard to be raised immediately. The final showdown of the largest and most catastrophic civil war of the ancient world was imminent. The two camps were divided from one another by a plain extending about 5 miles. Pompey enjoyed a double defense of sorts, due to the nature of the country and because the town was situated on elevated ground. Across this valley ran a small river or rivulet, which rendered the approach to the mountain very difficult. Due to perfect weather conditions on the day, Pompey's numerical superiority, and the flat plain that lay between them, Caesar thought that moving towards his already arrayed enemy would entice him to move down from his hill and engage in battle. But Pompey stayed put, and it soon became obvious that the commander of the Optimates would not dare leave the high ground, even though Caesar's army was composed largely of new recruits. When they reached the edge of the plain, which was the most disadvantageous location to initiate a battle, Caesar pointed that out to his largely inexperienced troops. The subsequent delay of their advance enlivened the Pompeians, who advanced a little way, but without abandoning their advantageous position. Cautiously but steadily, Caesar's legions began the slow upward march towards Pompey's position. The army of the Optimates consisted of 13 legions, arranged in 3 lines. The cavalry, that was about 6,000 men strong, was positioned on the wings and was commanded by Titus Labienus, with an equal number of light troops dispersed among them. In total, the Pompeian army numbered around 70,000 men. During that day, Julius Caesar led a total of 8 legions that were almost at their full strength, numbering around 40,000 men, and he also had a slight numerical advantage in cavalry, with a total of 8,000 horsemen under his command, who were all placed on his left wing. His infantry was arranged in the usual triple line, with the elite 10th Legion of veterans occupying its usual position on the right wing, with the 5th and 3rd Legion on his left. The battle that was about to come was to be, by far, the largest clash of the Civil War in terms of scale. But the main bulk of the Caesarian legions were not composed of the battle-hardened and victorious veterans who had campaigned with Caesar for over a decade, but were manned mainly by new levies and recruits who were not accustomed to large-scale engagements. Needless to say, they proceeded hesitantly against an enemy who was numerically superior and in an advantageous position. Sensing this, Caesar ran up and down the line encouraging his soldiers, with one of our sources claiming that he seized a shield from a soldier and advanced against the enemy by himself, saying to the officers around him that this shall be the end of his life and their military service. While he shamed them to their faces and exhorted them to advance, he was soon joined by the tribunes who took position by his side, something that encouraged the rest of the army to rush towards the enemy. The bulky mass of the two armies had no room to maneuver on this rocky and inclined battleground, and cavalry action could not be easily initiated due to the rugged terrain, so the infantry was to play a decisive role. The battle proved a much longer affair than the clash at Thapsus, and the Pompeians managed to withstand the initial and most formidable charge of their adversaries. After the exchange of more than 30,000 pila, the similarly equipped and trained armies engaged in a long drawn-out and exhaustive contest, in which no one seemed to be gaining the upper hand. For hours they were battling it out, with neither the Pompeians being able to break the line of their enemy, nor the Caesarians being able to push back the multitude of shields that were blocking their advance. After hours of this exhaustive hand-to-hand fighting, Caesar's right wing began to edge out their opponents. Once more it was the grizzled veterans of the 10th Legion who managed to take the better of their enemies, despite being severely under strength. With only a fraction of their manpower still able to fight, the men of the 10th, most of them in their 40s and 50s, who were the spearhead of numerous campaigns and battles, did what they have done countless times before, displaying an unparalleled courage and endurance as they began to push Pompey's numerically superior left flank back uphill. With this severe crisis unfolding, Pompey was forced to remove a whole legion from his right wing and bring it to the rescue of his hard-pressed left wing. This was the moment that Caesar was waiting for. He ordered his cavalry to charge directly against Pompey's weakened right wing and send part of his auxiliaries to charge Pompey's undefended camp. Labienus, who commanded the cavalry, saw the movement of Caesar's auxiliary cavalry and charged with some of the troops to intercept them. Amidst this turmoil, Pompey's hard-pressed infantry perceived Labienus's movement as an attempted retreat. It was the turning point in the battle, and soon the army of the Optimates routed in panic towards the city of Munda. The Caesarians mercilessly pursued the remnants of the Pompeian army all the way to the city of Munda, which they soon placed under siege. "30,000 Pompeians lay dead on the battlefield that day, while losses on the Caesarian side were much lighter, ranging around 1,000 men. Munda was to be the last battle that Caesar ever fought, but it was also one of his hardest fought ones. He was later recorded as saying, "I often fought for victory, but at Munda I fought for my very existence." This was the largest civil war of the ancient world. The Optimates fought against Caesar tooth and nail, and it took all of Caesar's determination, drive, genius, and tenacity in order to achieve the final victory. Gaius Julius Caesar was triumphant, but his triumph would last for only 1 year, until the Ides of March 44 BC. Credit goes to our awesome patrons who make videos like this one possible. Consider joining them to support our work. You can also support us by subscribing to our channel and clicking the bell button to get notified when our new videos are released. And as always, thank you for watching.